Good afternoon and welcome back to Preshift. Dylan Higgins here. So today we're going to do Preshift beverage training going over types of spirits. We'll get into the specifics on each of these in their own individual versions of Preshift. So hopefully you've seen the other parts. I did a sort of a quick brief introduction to all these things. Basically, spirits works like this. They are fermented beverage alcohols that are then distilled. The process of distillation is pretty straightforward. You take a fermented mash, be it a beer or wine, and you'll often hear terms like distiller's beer or low wine or high wine when we're talking about the actual distillate, and we'll get to those terms as we progress. But yeah, so you take that and then put it into a still, and there are a couple of different types of stills. There are what we call column stills, and there are pot stills. There are other stills. There are hybrid stills and a few other things we could talk about. But by and large, we're talking about two different styles of still. The first style of still is called a pot still. This has been the one that's been around forever. It's what all Scotch has to be made in, cognac, Armagnac, a handful of other distilled spirits from around the world have to be made in these. Not everybody does. Effectively, what it is it's a pot. It's a giant copper pot, usually copper, though you can use other metals as needed, that has a bath in it and then a heating element underneath of some sort. The heating element from underneath makes the pot warm. As the pot gets warm, it drives the heat that begins the process of boiling the water inside of the pot. Alcohol has a lower boiling point than water, and as such it will begin to evaporate out before the water will. Because of that, we can concentrate the alcohol and remove a bunch of the other elements. The water, heavy solids, things along those lines can be distilled out. So distilling is an act of purification, if you will. Effectively, what happens is the ethanol will begin to evaporate out of the solution, and it'll start to travel up in the pot. We then put a cooling neck of some sort on it, which then, because of the surface area and the distance from the heat, begins to cool that vapor back down into a liquid. It's then collected elsewhere, and that's the beginning of the process. It sounds like it might be the kind of thing that was super efficient. Well, it's only so efficient. So the first run will get you to a very high level of purity, something over 80%, maybe 90%, depending on what you're using. So a lot of times they'll take the hearts of that first distillation and re-distill it. So that's when it says distilled 2 times, 3 times, 10 times. What they're talking about is actually taking the hearts of that distillate and putting it back in the still and doing it again. This removes even more, though it is the law of diminishing returns applies here. So the more you distill something, the less percentage gain you get in purity, though you overall become more pure. So it goes 85%, then 91%, then 93%, then 94%, then 94.5%, so on and so forth. So the more you distill, the closer to pure you get, though you'll never actually achieve purity. You get what I'm saying there. It's an asymptotic situation. So there's that. The other type of pots, or the other type of still, is called a column still. It's literally a column. So it's a tall, cylindrical column, effectively acting as a perpetual perpetual still. And then you'll place plates along the way, and each of those plates will act as a heating element to further the distillation. So you can achieve 10 times distillation by never having to remove any of the product. You don't have to take the heads or the tails or the hearts out and redistill them. You basically just force it all the way through. And as it progresses further and further up, it will become more and more pure as it goes. Column stills are highly efficient, but efficiency is sometimes not the most desired result, and that's because congeners, which are the impurities, if you will, in a spirit, are what give it its flavor. Otherwise, it would just taste like rubbing alcohol. And that leads us to the 7 base types of spirit. There are really, when it comes down to it, there's 5, but whatever. Two of them are basically spin-offs of the other ones. The first one, the one you're going to see the most commonly, the one that is often referred to as the thing that everybody can do, is vodka. Vodka, the word means water in ancient Slavic, in a Slavic language. I can't recall off the top of my head if that was Russian or Polish. In either event, vodka literally means water, and the idea is to be presenting a pure ethanol spirit. So it's as close to neutral grain spirit as you can get. By definition, it's supposed to be a grain spirit. That grain can be potato, it can be rye, it can be corn. Actually, potatoes aren't a grain, so it has to be, you have to use something starchy. And again, we're talking about the process of converting starch to sugar and then fermenting. Once it ferments, you then put it through the still. The more you distill it, the closer to pure you get. There you go. Okay, so that's vodka. Flavored vodka is not really a vodka, it's actually a liqueur. So, just to clarify on that. Number 2, we would be talking about whiskey. Whiskey is effectively vodka that has then been aged. And it's vodka coming from a specific, each region has its specific grain source. So corn is the base for bourbon, for example. Bourbon is a form of whiskey. It is a beer that we make out of corn that is then distilled and then aged in American oak barrels. We'll spend a lot of time on bourbon during bourbon's 10 minutes of fame. But for right now, we'll just suffice to say that that's how bourbon works. Scotch is also whiskey, but it's made from barley, predominantly, instead of corn, predominantly. And goes through the same process, and we'll go into, there's a lot of detail about Scotch to get into. We'll talk about that later. Just suffice to say that they're cousins. And until you put them in oak barrels, they're effectively vodka. So there's that. There's also Japanese whiskeys, Tennessee whiskeys, Canadian whiskey, rye, a handful of other things, all of which have their own regional specificities. So there you go. Mezcal, which is the umbrella name for all agave spirits. There are about 40 different agave species that are approved to make mezcal in Mexico. And those, depending on regionality and production method, can be broken down even further. Tequila is effectively a mezcal. It's a very specific mezcal. So is raicilla, bacanora. But ultimately, you make a pulque, and that's a process that we'll get into. Distill the pulque, you've got mezcal. Let's see, brandy is a distillate of wine. Generally, it's great, but you can also make fruit cider base brandies, and there's an entire 20 minutes I could talk about that, but we'll get into that in its own 10-minute session. And then the 5th true version of spirit is rum. Rums and cachaças are made from sugarcane. You can get a little more specific, and then we're talking about rum agricoles, we're talking about charandas from central Mexico, and we'll get into that whole thing on its own. But basically it's sugarcane juice that we then turn into a distilled spirit. There's gin, which is effectively an aromatized vodka, and there are a couple ways to do that. We'll get into those processes in gin's version of this. And then the last one is liqueurs and cordials, and that's actually where flavored vodka should be. That's actually where flavored whiskeys should be, and that's where all the things like Amaro and bitters and those kinds of things all fit into that category too. Anyway, I hope you have a great service tonight, and check in with me later for some more.